So it's an absolute pleasure. I want to thank everyone so much for the opportunity to talk about the Meraki platform, the APIs, and the products and how they're evolving, and how our customers are using them each and every day, and hopefully answer your questions as well. First and foremost, quick introduction. My name is Tony Carmichael. I'm a product manager on the Meraki product management team, looking after API and dev ecosystem. I'm also joined, actually, really proud to have Omar here. So I'm going to let Omar do a quick introduction. He's going to do the second half of this session today. Omar comes to us from our digital workplace team. So he is very much a customer of Meraki in the sense that we often like to make sure we're kind of eating our own products, right? Using our own products. We have a really close partnership with that team. We see them resembling a lot of the kind of the same needs that our customers have. So he's going to talk a little bit to how he was able to leverage the Meraki platform and the APIs in his day-to-day. So with that, a kind of quick overview on where we are. So obviously, it's been quite some time since that first session that Tom mentioned. Over those years, we've scaled not just in the breadth, right, in terms of the different products that we offer. We went from that pure wireless play to really being driven purely by our customers to add more products, right? Make it easier to manage and configure a switch, a security product, right? And even mobile devices. But over the years, my team, right, on the dashboard, what we call the dashboard and backend team, which consists of our entire engineering organization that's looking after making sure that we have presence around the world. And that dashboard, when you go to dashboard.meraki.com or api.meraki.com, is snappy, right? You get whatever you need back, whether that's through your browser or through the interface. And you can see just kind of some of the sheer scale here. We don't really talk publicly about this much because the fact that you don't notice it is exactly what we want. The pages should load, you should get the real-time information, you should get the alerts that you've subscribed to, and your network should always just be up and running, right? That's the goal. But if you look at some of these numbers, just shy of 400,000 customers now using the platform. These are kind of the online customer networks that we have around the globe. 100 million clients connected, so that includes any Meraki device that's supporting one or more connected IP devices. This is staggering. I was actually quite surprised when we ran the numbers on this, but we serve on average about 800 million pages per day, and that's purely talking about the front end. That doesn't speak to the other services that the back end hosts, including, of course, the API. On the API, and this is part of the reason we wanted to kind of talk to the group about this, we're seeing massive scale. We're up in the 30 to 40 million requests per day being served, and those aren't weighted. So in one request, you can provision lots of devices, or in one request, you could set up one SSID or hundreds of SSIDs. So they're not quite weighted. Now, if we think about the kind of architecture, which obviously this is quite symbolic and not the real kind of version. We've got tertiary sharding. We've got all of our infrastructure around the globe, and that's constantly evolving, and it's elastic. So as we have a customer that tomorrow decides they're going to turn up 1,000 more networks, we need to be able to support that, right, without necessarily having the immediate foresight for that. But what we've noticed over the years as we as a company have evolved, we were very focused on marketing Dashboard, right? Dashboard as the product. This is the interface that our customers and partners and service providers use. But the reality is that that's starting to shift in the kind of inbound requests. Roughly 20% of all of our kind of dashboard organizations and customers have not only kind of their dashboard access and account, but are also actively using the API as well, right? So that's a pretty substantial percent of our customer base now that's interacting through the API. And that doesn't even include some of the internal integrations that are also using those public APIs, like, for example, DNA Center, Umbrella, for example. All of those are using our APIs as well. So the point here is, as kind of we continue this kind of open API economy and model, starting to really see a lot of our IT service teams and IT service management as a whole shifting to using those APIs. We've had these services for some time. In fact, back then when we did Wireless Field Day, we already had our XCAP or Captive Portal API. This is about making sure that you have, you have the option, if you were to want to to set up guest wireless and make it an experience, right? So make it, multi-click or accept your terms and conditions, or perhaps, you want to get some information, like in a hotel room, you want the room number, for example. That's all possible through the XCAP. We actually have over 500,000 of those kind of up and running today. We've got the scanning and webhook API, which is really about giving location information and data. This is heavily being utilized by solutions like the July Systems or now DNA Spaces solution, for example. And then what we're really going to talk to you about here is the evolution around the dashboard API, which is a RESTful architecture API. And it's really just to complement the dashboard user interface. So if we look at the way, if we really break down the use case, right? This shouldn't come as any surprise, because the reality is this is the kind of day in the life of an IT manager or an IT services team. It starts with kind of your day zero provisioning, right? Setting up your network, setting up your firewall rules and ACLs, configuring your infrastructure. But the reality is you're never going to kind of get everything covered in the provisioning cycle. You're either going to realize, oh, I should have probably turned on BPDU guard and I forgot, and now I need to turn that on across your hundreds of thousands of ports, which we have seen and observed. Or maybe your teachers are starting to say, hey, the content filtering that you turned on day one is a little too rigid. We need you to add a whitelist URL. And you need to, again, do that to all of your sites and locations, right? So that's why these are really complementary, and they're really one and the same in terms of the REST API itself, but they're different stages in the life cycle. Monitoring, this is something that excites me because if we look at all of the inbound requests and we map those to the API type and the information that the API endpoint's providing, we can very easily categorize them. So one would say, claim a license. That's very clearly provisioning. But another might be, tell me the current connected status of all my access points and switches in my entire organization. Very clearly a monitoring endpoint. We're seeing about a 50-50 split. It's roughly 48% of the volume coming in is about provisioning and change management, and the other kind of split of that is about monitoring. And what that tells us is that there's a shift happening where you're starting to see customers using kind of the cloud APIs for the same kind of capabilities that you might see more traditionally around NetFlow, syslog, and SNMP. And this is something that, like I said, we're closely watching, and also an area that we plan to continue to invest in. Yes?
Just to understand the numbers, you have this web-based application that I can use as dashboard.
Yes.
And that web-based application is obviously using your API to grab the data.
That's right. A lot of those are private APIs, but you're absolutely right.
So those private APIs wouldn't be in this number.
Correct. Totally separated.
Okay, now I get it.
Now I'll speak to that because that's an important distinction. So Meraki came about, and we really pivoted to enterprise in roughly 2010. That was before, the open API specification, REST-based APIs. Now, a lot of people say, okay, API is any kind of third-party protocol that you can interact with, but I'm speaking specifically to web-based or cloud-based API. So the honest truth is Meraki's got some catching up to do, and part of our engineering mantra is that we really need to go to an API-first strategy where anything that we add to the dashboard, and when I say the dashboard, I really mean the user interface, we complement, and in an ideal world, we're using a private API that we can turn public, or even more optimally, my goal is to make everything a public API, right?
Lead into the next question. What's the percentage of things that you can configure through dashboard that are also configurable through the public API?
That's a very good question. This is at the very DNA of what we're doing. So this API-first strategy is relatively new within Meraki. Formerly, it was pretty much kind of on an ad hoc basis or as-needed basis, right? Now that we're investing in this full term, obviously we have a whole myriad of different products. They're in different stages of maturity in terms of API coverage. However, there's a very kind of clear strategy around this in that most customers spend the majority of their time setting up and configuring the Meraki MX security appliances. And it's not a surprise. It's because it's the most feature-rich, feature-dense, and it has the most configuration that you might want to apply. That isn't necessarily common across your entire user base. So we're roughly 70% of the way there in terms of API coverage there. And the plan is to kind of laser focus and go through several sprint cycles where we are rounding that off, just because that's ultimately what we're seeing from the market and our customers and our service providers. We can say something similar to all the rest of the products in the portfolio, but that just gives you a sense of where we are. Will we be in a world where we have 100% coverage for all the things? Of course, that's our North Star. But for now, as we kind of continue to put investment in it, we're really doing a heat map approach where we're looking at what are the settings that customers typically change. And I think most of us in this room or those watching have a general sense for that, but there isn't kind of a one-size-fits-all. So we're looking at that data and then prioritizing as our strategy per product.
Okay, so let's say I am a true believer in the religion of automation.
Sure.
And
Amen.
And I want to automate my Meraki deployment,
Yep.
whatever that is.
Yes.
And then obviously, based on my network design, I need certain features.
Yes.
And I start automating stuff, and all of a sudden I go like, oh shit, I can't automate this particular bit because there is no public API for it.
Yep. Yep.
How often will that happen, and what can I do in that case?
Well, so I'm actually going to touch on this a little bit. I want to make sure that I definitely address your question. So what I'll do is I'll circle back and get a yay or a nay. But I definitely want to speak to that because you've called out something that's, again, at the core of the strategy. I can talk to that. Also, yeah, in fact, Omar is going to touch on that because he's a consumer of our APIs. Yes. I'm going to give you the product guy answer, and he's going to give you the real world answer. So this is actually exactly what you just touched on. This is a recording that was provided to us by a customer that basically said, Meraki, you guys are great. You've got amazing functionality in the dashboard. I have 120 networks, and I now need to push out this specific setting 120 times. Because I chose not to go with the template option, which is a capability that allows for you to do one-to-many bound configuration. It's a really powerful feature, but it's got pros and cons. The customer chose to go the track of, I'm going to go API, not going to go templates. But obviously there's those corner cases. So I want to make sure that everyone knows that first of all, we have a pretty rich UI, right? And we have all the config in the user interface and dashboard.meraki.com. And then we have this kind of in-between area that we really, I would say, the vast majority of our customers use because it makes it easy and it doesn't require for the IT team or the operations team to take on the overhead or onus of I got to write Python, I got to write Ruby, I got to put up the system, I got to host it, I got to make sure it's secure. Again, that's a good subset of the Meraki customer base is the reality, perhaps including Meraki IT. I don't want to put your words in your mouth. But the other side of that coin is we want complete flexibility, right? And that's the API model. So what the vast majority of what you can configure, like I said, per product, it's already available through the APIs. The typical model that we see is kind of, these are all not mutually exclusive. So what we find is in the vast majority of cases, it's kind of a combination of these capabilities. For example, you can use the API, you can say bind it to this configuration, or you can say clone from this network container, copy all the base settings over, and now kickstart your automation workflow. And that's in majority of the cases puts you in a position today where even though we don't have that 100% coverage, you are in a place where you can use those in combination and kind of kick it off, get to where you need to go.
So you create templates effectively
Yes.
through the UI, and then through the API, you just apply templates to where you want to have them.
1 or 1,000 or 10,000. Yeah. That's absolutely correct. Yep. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Another nasty question. I hate UIs because I can never see how my device is configured in one place.
Sure.
And I can't track the changes that were made to the device configuration. So do you also have a text configuration file that I could pull off?
So that is, well, nasty. I wouldn't describe it as nasty. So we do get that, right? Mm-hmm. There's actually a couple of partners that have, using our API and what you can, in effect, liberate or extrapolate, right, config. And essentially built that, where, in fact,
reverse engineering.
That's right.
From REST.
That's right. Now, I would love to say to you today, like, we've got it. We have something within Dashboard actually that's called configuration sync that will actually take a look and do a differential comparison between, and it could be one-to-one or one-to-many, and it'll give you a red, green, or yellow as you do that diff. And if there's any disparity or any difference in the config of the source and destination network or networks, it will be yellow. It'll be red if it in fact isn't supported on the destination, or it'll be green if you're good to go and you're synced, right? So our end state is that we end up in this world where we've invested in this API first strategy, and we can very, very quickly and iteratively build tooling like that on top of the API framework in Dashboard. So Dashboard as a user interface is in effect the best UI that we can put out. It's first class, in other words. But if, let's say, we were to want to extend that functionality to a Cisco customer that's got on-prem, they've got Meraki, and they want it in DNA Center, there's nothing preventing us, Cisco, from building that as well. Right? That's kind of the vision. And we're on our way there.
Just another quick question.
Yeah.
If you bring in new features,
yep.
will they have an open API from day one?
That is absolutely the goal. Now, I would be lying to you if I were to tell you that is absolutely what's happening. But here's something. I'll give you a very real example of this. We're about to release, Umbrella on top of the Meraki products, right? And so, or on top of Meraki Wireless. This is in the current firmware. This is public knowledge. But the point is, there's a UI element that lets you set the Umbrella API key on the Meraki side. Like, great. First thing I asked was, where's the API, right? So we're coming back and we're going to do that, but that's because that work was scoped before we kicked off this new strategy. It was scoped over a year ago, right? But anything going forward, and this is why the dashboard team that I'm a part of kind of spans the entire portfolio. We are constantly holding each of the different groups within our engineering accountable to that. And we're actually working on implementing engineering framework that in effect requires that as part of the development cycle. So like I said, we're not 100% there, but we're absolutely working in the next quarter, I would say. I would love to see us be in a place where we have 100%. Anything else that comes out comes with a complemented API.
So more or less everything that is released after Q2 will have.
Yeah. We're going to watch this.
I will.
OK. Yeah. No, hold us accountable. But that is absolutely the goal. I mean, in pure honesty, this is the absolute kind of focus and the strategy that we have on the engineering side. So what you can see here is just a really simple kind of turnkey example of how that investment has come to fruition. This was built in partnership with a customer who had a pretty extensive kind of operational workflow for setting up their networks. They selected Meraki for their new refresh, and they wanted it fully and completely automated. They wanted to be able to also not necessarily hand the keys to the castle over to their operations and provisioning team, in effect, the truck roll, right, team that's doing low voltage cabling and so forth. They wanted to just give them a really simple front end that only collected the information that was needed, right? Name of the site, address of the site. There was different profiles, so you might have like a very small sales branch, and then you might have a larger environment that's going to have more switching. It's going to have different SSIDs and so forth. I know it's a bit of an eye chart or kind of fast moving here, but you'll notice there's a template drop down. This is in effect what I was talking about earlier, where you're pairing API with the template capabilities. This means that the technician that's deploying can select, this is a store, it's a kind of your t-shirt size, right? Small, medium, large, and depending on what they select, behind the scenes, we will auto-provision the network by binding it to the template and then doing some supplemental provisioning through the API as well. No touching of dashboard. It uses a service API key to interact between ServiceNow and the Meraki products. So the last thing I wanted to do is provide some really fast, snappy examples where we're doing a differential or a comparison between what you might see in the dashboard and the same API responses in a machine and human readable format, right? JSON. So you can see here, for example, we've got a snapshot. This is of actually the infrastructure that Omar manages. You can see a few devices that are alerting. The reason they're alerting, by the way, is because they're failing an 802.1x radius test. So they're a supplicant and they forward .1x. The reason I wanted to call that out is on the right, we actually have an example of an API endpoint that's public. All you need is your API key, and you simply say, what's the status of all my devices? And we respond back with all of the detail. So it's super simple, very straightforward, and this unlocks a whole kind of world of opportunities, right? Whether it's monitoring and kind of real-time visibility into a third-party system, into your operational tools, whether they're custom or off-the-shelf, kind of sky's the limit there, right? You could even, for example, store this, report on it over time, and create threshold-based alerts in a platform like Xenos, for example. We see a lot of that. A second example is kind of moving from an let's say on-prem or on-LAN, let's say SNMP-based or syslog-based protocol, where you're wanting to just simply see what are port counters, byte counters, and what's the status of the wired interface, for example. Moving that to a kind of cloud-generated or cloud event-driven alerting. And we actually recently released HTTP-based webhooks for that model, right? So you will have to open up some receiving system. Now that could be PagerDuty, or it could be your own system. And you could have it just open and receiving and ingesting these alerts, putting them into the right categories, and in most cases, kicking off a triaged workflow based off of that. So first off, thank you. I'm going to now hand it off. This is kind of the exciting part, right, where you get to see some real kind of pointed examples of how this is being used by IT teams around the world, including our own.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Omar Ontiveros, and I manage the IT services team for the Digital Workplace. So speaking to Digital Workplace, every time I say that, I've kind of actually noticed everywhere I go and everywhere I read, like that seems to be a buzzword. People are either saying Digital Workplace or just kind of using that phrase a lot. And what that means to us essentially is, it's kind of like when you take all the foundational IT stuff and you say, okay, well, it's all evolving. You've got IoT, you've got now connected spaces. How do you kind of merge all this stuff together under one umbrella and essentially build sort of a synergy around this new world that we're living in with APIs, machine learning, and sensors everywhere. So that is what we call Digital Workplace. And I'll just kind of skip along. What that allows us to do, as I mentioned, it's IT facilities under one roof. We manage 4,000 devices across 8 locations. We are a small team. So automation is our best friend, and of course we eat our own dog food, and that includes the hardware as well as the firmware and things such as the API. So talking a little bit about that API. So I started back in 2015 as just a systems admin. My background is in networking. I'm not a programmer. I never got a computer science degree. I went sidetracked. But I was always a fan of the lazy sysadmin. Like, why are you going to spend all your time doing repeatable things when a machine can do it for you? So, I'm going to just kind of highlight a typical use case, and some of this will kind of refer back to some of the questions you have, and I'm happy to expand upon it. And that's the solving the teleworker kit scaling challenge. So going back to 2015, 2016, it was like, I'd only been at Meraki for maybe 8 months or so, and been working through some projects. And our support director at the time told us, like, hey, Omar, we got this big problem. At our headquarters, the power seems like to go out whenever it feels like it. And that's bad because our support team's there. And when the power goes out, we can't answer support calls. Customers are frustrated. Business is frustrated. So they were like, well, we need a DR scenario. Like, how can you help us build out a DR scenario so that way we're not missing out on these calls? And the first thing that came to mind was like, well, what if we gave everyone a teleworker kit? Meraki makes the Z1, at the time, the Z1 platform, now Z3. So it was like, oh, well, we can give these little boxes, which we make. We can give them to every one of our support reps. They can take it home. And if the network goes down, we send everyone home and they can answer calls. And in theory, it was like, oh, great, this is awesome. Problem is kind of like Tony Carmichael alluded to, and he showed some slides around it, is that clicking. Like, if you can imagine 100, 200 customer support reps. And at the time, our Digital Workplace and that IT team was really about, it was like 3 people. Was it like 3 or 4 people? It was like about 3 or 4 people. And we were like, man, how are we going to get these all done? Like, if we were going to go click through the UI, we would have spent probably about 18 hours or so. We weren't going to do that. So at the time, we had known that the API was being built out. Our team, we have real close liaison with the product team as well as engineering. And they were like, hey, we're building out this API stuff. There's got to be some use cases in there where you guys can actually use it. And I'm like, you know what? There is. I have this problem, and I need to solve it. So kind of running down the list, it's 100 devices that need to be provisioned. We want to be lazy about this. Web-based UI is slick, but however, we're going to be dealing with too many clicks. So we said, all right, well, let's take a look at the API. All right. So, and I think you kind of talked a little bit about this, as a customer or as a person using the API, how do you make sure that you don't just jump in and start coding something without missing some key gotcha? Well, I mean, that comes out pretty much in the scoping phase, and that's sort of what we did is I broke down the problem. I said, okay, well, before I start writing anything, are the APIs that we currently have in production, mind you, this was late 2015, early 2016, I'm kind of struggling to place the date, but we were like, okay, the API is sort of new, but which ones do we have? And I was like, well, first of all, Meraki devices need to be added to an inventory. So if anyone's worked on a Meraki network before or used any of our devices, you know that we send you a device, we send you a serial number, or we send you a licensing key to use that. That is your kind of your guarantee that you can use this device and pop it into your network, and it belongs to you. So I had to add a whole bunch of these devices into our inventory. Then the next step required us to generate what are called dashboard networks. Now, the MX and the Z1s are a unique appliance of ours where you can't have multiple of these sitting in the same network. They have to be individually addressed networks. So that was a different challenge. So we had to set up one network for every single device. And then, of course, and we talked a little bit about this, is locking down the network config by binding to a template. Now, that makes sense on a whole bunch of levels. Now, honestly, could we have done this without doing that? Yes. But the reason why we use templates is because they guarantee a certain level of consistency and hence security. So we wanted to make sure that if you're a support representative and you're working out of our headquarters in San Francisco, you get the security policy and the configuration that you need for San Francisco. If you happen to be in their Sydney office, same thing. If you're in London, echo, ditto, same thing. So those are essentially the main 3 steps. And of course, the 4th step, and we've talked about this a little bit, is this binding to the, actually, I don't think we talked about this, is once you create the dashboard network, you've essentially assigned a configuration in the cloud that says, like, this is the device, this is its characteristics, it's bound to this template. But that configuration needs a place to live, and that's essentially going to be the device you've added in your inventory. So that last step is where you kind of marry your network configuration to an actual appliance. So that would be the last step in the chain. And of course, after I kind of scoped this down, I went back. We have a pretty well-documented API. I went back. I confirmed there's calls that do all these things, ticked off the right marks. I'm like, OK, I think I can do this. Remember, I'm not a computer science expert. I'm not a real programmer. But I saw something. I said, you know, I think I can build something. And I didn't want to kind of bore you guys with too many code examples, so I'll kind of run through these pretty quick. But first step was like, hey, we need to add devices to an inventory. Look, as I said, didn't really know too much coding, but at the time, Ruby seemed to be the hotness. I said, well, if I'm going to try this, I'm going to, you're laughing there, but it's sort of true. I was like, oh, you know, if I'm going to pick something up, let's just pick what's cool. And I found out, you know, a lot of developers use this. It's got to be easy. It's got to be a lot of documentation. And it turns out it was really easy. Like I just went on and I said, how do you call it a REST thing? And I was like, oh, in Ruby, you'd use this. And I was like, oh, you use this gem. And I was like, wow, like most of the work's already done. All I had to do is figure out like how to actually call the APIs. And as it, you know, so we have here on line 77, that's where the actual call happens to the API. You can see it says API, then the API is versioned. Then we're pulling from the organizations. We need a dashboard organization ID, which says this is my organization, and then the claim call is what we're doing. So we go ahead and we send that. We send over an API key, like as Tony mentioned, like this is all like we use like tokens to make sure that it's very secure. So I pass that along, and then of course you'll see in step 80, like I'm adding a serial number. So this is me adding devices. So this lump of code has to go run over and over again. Say, all right, here's the dashboard org ID, here's the API key, and here's the serial number. Here's the other serial number. Here's the other serial number, and then it posts all these and throws them in our inventory. Same thing with the next step, of course, I mentioned was creating a dashboard network. Same sort of thing. As I mentioned, Meraki networks are unique for MX devices, have to be unique per the device. So we were like, OK, this is an opportunity. Like we had already been setting up teleworker networks as one-offs, and there wasn't any consistency around the naming convention. Some of them would say Omar's fancy teleworker home kit, and some would say Chris Helzenbeck boss network, and you know there was others to say like engineering this, or someone would have even like anime character names. It was like, you know, just really start up real random confusing stuff. So we're like, okay, let's pause. This is a good opportunity for us to standardize our naming of our teleworker kits. So we went ahead and as you see on line 85, like we can define a variable that says like this is going to be the name, and it's going to be teleworker hyphen first name space last name. And you know, at the time, and I think to this day, we really don't have any namespace conflicts across the Meraki employees. So it pretty much served us pretty well. So that's how we identified the name of our network. And then the next batch, same thing, org ID, API key. And then request body, we pass this variable there, and then that sends it out to get provisioned. We can tag networks, so we went ahead and added a couple extra variables that we wanted in our script around locale, and this was like San Francisco, Sydney, or London. And then team, are you which support team are you on? We have different queues for different types, so we wanted to kind of flag that as well. So we were able to do that all, just a few lines of code. And then same thing, I'm not going to run through this example too much, but same thing. This is the bind configuration template. So now we're at 93 to 114 lines. And somewhere in there, we have a case statement to pick out stuff and assign network IDs to these different locations. We're dropping those in at the bottom. You know, things sort of happen. And then, of course, binding configuration device. This is our last step. And this is the Hail Mary where we say, all right, those devices are already sitting in our organization. We want to pull a specific one. And we want to drop in serial. So So all in all, that was kind of like my thinking around setting up the API. This was our first step, first stab. Anyone have any questions on like any of these little bits right here? Seems like, no? Any questions?
Well, the one thing that you should point out is that, yeah, this is great. I love what you're doing. Error checking and error handling.
It's great that you mentioned that because how this solution. Okay, 135 lines of code. Few sanity checks baked in. All right, I'm going to call that out. This is me being honest. This is the honest system administrator out there. This is a one-off. This code I built, that we wrote, I knew I was going to have to run the same code like over and over again. It was my first stab at it. I wasn't too concerned as long as it sort of worked, and it did. It took about 4 hours of coding. I'll be honest, it took 1 hour to POC it. Was 4 hours of coding. I was able to save about 18 hours doing this edge case, and it worked. And there was a couple edge cases we did catch because of my trying to write this in 4 hours. Certain names like O'Hara, names of the single. You guys already know what I'm alluding to. I was like, this thing something weird happened, and we went back and fixed those edge cases. But the point I'm trying to make here is like we weren't trying to automate like we're not like a Starbucks-sized organization. We're trying to do thousands of things. This is like a one-off code thing. We could have used a dashboard. I could have, like I said, at the time we were about maybe 3 or 4 people. We could have just done an all-nighter, bought some pizza and beer, and just cranked at it, clicked on dashboard over and over again. We would have probably still finished regardless. But this was a good opportunity for us to kind of start using something that we knew was being built out. It solved a fundamental problem for us, and we were able to do it pretty quick. So, yeah, so a few sanity checks. Yeah, when I look back at the code, I'm like, I could have done it better. Which leads to my next stop. What about deleting networks? Now this is where I was like, and that is kind of important. So we did add way more sanity checks to the code, and also me and my hype of trying to figure out what language I want to use. I decided to write this in Go. I was like, I'm getting a feeling for this thing. It's getting easier. I can do Ruby now. Let's try doing it in a different platform. So I don't expect you guys to read through the code, but this is real good Go code. It's got lots of sanity checks built into it. And I guess the other takeaway of building it in Go was I was able to get like a portable binary. And in this particular use case, I wanted to be able to like give this to like the person that's helping with like the account offboarding and say, here's the binary, run it. Here's the API keys. Make sure these are in your bash config file, and just run this thing, and it'll do its thing. And it worked. It worked. And yes, I addressed the sanity checks. A lot of error checking happened. So round 2, much better.
One question.
Oh, sure.
If you, usually if you apply templates, if you apply it another time, it will do the same thing. If you call an API twice, like adding net...
idempotency, is that what you're referring to?
What?
Idempotency?
Exactly.
Yeah,
how you prevent that you like run the same script and it messes up everything?
No, totally.
Already did.
No, this has error checking, and it checks for idempotency. You can run it multiple times, and you're going to get the same. It'll be consistent. It'll roll back if it doesn't, unless it knows it's going to work and it's going to actually complete properly. It'll run, and if it detects that it won't, it does not run the operation.
The script does that, or the API?
The script does that. Now, I can't really speak to the API, but I won't be surprised if it actually gives you like a particular like 5.0 or 5.02 or some sort of an error.
Yes, it'll respond back.
The real question is, and I was struggling with this morning, do you have any transactional consistency across multiple API requests? So can you go like, okay, now I'm starting my operation, and then you do like 10 API calls, and 9 out of 10 fails. And I would like to roll back to before I started.
We actually have a quick reveal at the end that will answer that for you.
Okay, yeah, we'll get to that. But that being said, at this point, and most of this was written a couple years back, this script we actually still sort of use. But that being said, all that error checking was baked in. All the sanity checking, idempotency, all those sort of stuff got taken care of during this round. So that was kind of our first foray into actually using the API to solve some real problems. As I mentioned, these problems are not scale problems, but they do have a certain facet of scale, but they're not like big, like I got one network and I want to build out thousands of networks. This is just like a couple hundred, small team, 3 or 4 people, really trying to solve some real problems without, just button mashing all day long. So API did allow us to do that. And that being said, once we started using it for those types of use cases, we got very comfortable in just writing out different little utilities. Most of my team, like we're systems admins, we're Unixy type people. We really like the small tool approach to solving problems. So we built out a lot of small scripts that solve things like get device statuses, and we can run that Ruby. It'll pipe the thing. We can pipe those commands using the pipe command off to other, and get some real answers. So we got like this one will return back some stuff, let us know online or offline. Get network info. This one will pull out the network IDs for us, which are a key component when you do other automations within the API. Almost every single call, not almost every single, but a whole bunch of them do require like you to identify your network ID at some level so it knows like which devices it's going to handle. So that was a very useful call as well. Yeah, and with that, I will hand it over to him. Any other questions? I'm happy to answer while I'm up here.
Just for me,
sure.
You started with this one project, yeah? And you got hooked and
Yes, totally.
What is in your daily life? So for every task you have, think about, can I do this with an API call?
I'll be honest, there's some stuff where it's like super one-offs. Like if we're gonna just change one particular port, I'm not gonna like scaffold out this whole thing. It goes back to that trade-off I did on the original scope discovery. You ask yourself like, how much hours is this process gonna take? Now that we're much more familiar with the tools, and we actually have like a whole Git library of just tons and tons of code we've built over these last couple of years. It's so easy for me to just see a problem and say, oh, I just have to change this one value and I'm using this new API. Good example, and actually we just wrote the code on this just a couple weeks ago, is the MV Sense. We have a new camera platform that does a machine intelligence and that can like do people recognition. It'll count people that come into like the frame. So one of the things we're trying to solve as part of our connected spaces digital workplace is like answer simple questions like how many people are using our help desk? How many people are using our cafeteria services? How many people are grabbing snacks? So those types of problems can be really solved if you can just count people and say, oh, these many people came at these hours. So what we did really quickly was you use the MV Sense API, and in 30 lines of code, I was able to get a working example where we were pulling out this information that said, like, this is how many people came at this time. And we've talked a lot about teeing this stuff up and sending it out to other services. And you can send it out to the Splunks, to the Elasticsearch clusters, and we were able to do that. It was 30 lines of code, and we had that stuff piping to a data repository. It was cataloged, it was indexed. We could build out a Kibana board. We were counting, we had a number, and we're like, wow, look at that number, and we just kind of stare at it and be like, we did it. Like, it was like really easy. And but it kind of really did take that first step in saying like, there's a certain level of uncomfortableness, especially as a non-programmer type person approaching these sorts of things and knowing like, is my effort at this going to really generate tangible results? Are we actually going to get the value that we really want out of like these first and they're kind of like long shots in a way, because like that first example, like I had not used any programming language. I knew a little bit of Bash stuff here and there, but I never really used a formal language. And I'm like, well, I think I could do it in this many hours, but what if it really took me 2 days? Then that would have been me defeating the purpose. And I think it's real hard on that first initial jump to like make that call. I feel like my message to everybody is just take that first risk, see how it goes, and we did, and like after that we really did get hooked, and we really do approach things now from an API centric perspective. There was a couple things in here I did want to kind of chat a little bit about. People talked a lot about like programmability, and I kind of want to just make a thing. One of the things my team's really been looking at as the API evolves is how can we get this stuff in like configuration as code. I mentioned our team. We don't just do the network stuff, but we also manage a lot of systems. So we do have lots of like Ansible playbooks that we use for like server-centric type things. Like this is how you set up a web server. This is how you set up an Nginx config proxy. But that same rigor, we really wanted to push that out to like how we manage our devices as well. And as that we're watching that delta, like going from like the 70 to 100% feature gap, that will allow us like to put those devices, configure them in code, put them in a Git repository. And then that's the hotness. It's scalable, it's versionable, and it makes it so easy to just configure things. So I just want to conclude with that, and definitely hand it over to Tony.
Awesome. Just one thing that you should be mentioning. So I don't buy your 4 hours. You did creative accounting.
Creative accounting.
Yeah. But the other thing that's really important is that if you do something like that, then you make the same consistent mistake 100 times. So you configure all Tether workers equally wrong.
Oh, fair. That's a fair assessment. Yeah. Now, that being said, when I first ran this code, like I didn't actually run it like on our production network. Like I used a test network. I said, yeah, I did some common sense sanity checks. Certainly, I don't recommend anybody doing anything to a production network if they haven't felt comfortable with it or they haven't bulletproofed or tested it. But I am not going to say that people should not try. Like figure out find your risk tolerance and just kind of get your feet in there and just kind of do the thing. I did it like on a test lab network, and then after if it was a little more gutsy, did it on my home network. And I was like, okay, I think I have a good scope of the problem. I was pretty sure that if it was going to break anywhere, it was going to be around syntax, around names, because I was pulling this stuff out of like a CSV file. And at that point, you're like, don't know what's in the data, and that's where the surprises kind of come out. So.
Yeah, but you're consistent. You're consistently making 100 deployments.
Right.
They may be all right or all wrong, but they're consistent.
That's true. True. It's 100% right or 100% wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So I wanted to thank Omar so much for kind of sharing that story. Hopefully it brings a little bit of color and kind of makes it real, right? And where these APIs are being utilized by our customers, including our own IT. So we have a couple of cool announcements around our API, really kind of what we're focusing on. It starts with kind of this batch action framework and batch action model, which really handles like kind of the idempotent interaction and also allows for you to, in effect, interact with a REST API asynchronously and atomically. So this isn't new or unprecedented. Other SaaS providers like Salesforce, for example, allow for you to process a very high volume of data in either a get, put, or post. But if you think about the idea of we have customers, they've got lots of resources, whether that be a switch with 48 ports or maybe lots of networks that they want to change the time zone on, rather than making it to where you have to go through this iterative script model, we're working on a kind of code framework that allows for our customers through our current API endpoints to do that in batch. So this allows for you, and the future vision of this is you can kind of kick off an automation workflow in one batch put or post. You can choose whether you want to confirm that, meaning, yep, I want Meraki's backend to process this now, or if you set that parameter to false, it will stage it. So that down the road, when you have a maintenance window and you in fact want to kick it off, you can do a put, and you can set that to true, at which point we'll process that batch. And this is an example of the first implementation, which is in beta, we're testing it now, where you can, in effect, the resource and scope is a switch. Each resource in this kind of schema is a different switch port. And this example just applies the tag batch test. Now, that's pretty slick because tags can actually be bound to port config or kind of scheduling and things of that nature. And you can, like I said, in one call, asynchronously say, change these 48 ports, apply this config to it, and we will come back and either let you know that it was completed successfully or if it's failed. We're never going to process some subset of the batch. We're either going to come back and complete it or come back and let you know that it's failed.
The confirmed parameter.
Yes.
Does that mean synchronous versus asynchronous, or is it check versus deploy?
Synchronous versus asynchronous.
So you don't have something where I could just check whether the syntax and everything is correct and whether when applied this would actually work.
That's true. So we will add it once you process it and set this to true, we will process that, right? So you definitely, you're putting in a batch config. This is typically for your provisioning use case or creating tons of networks or things of that nature. But we'd love your feedback on that. We're just about out of time here. The other kind of really big announcement here, remember that kind of Omar's example here is, he's kind of custom writing some of this Ruby, right? But the whole point here is to make this easy and attainable for our customers, which aren't typically programmers. They might be, and they're starting to be, but they're not all programmers. So we're working towards a model where we are not only open API spec compliant, but we provide that spec publicly. And again, this is not unique. Most API providers either have a plan or are already providing this. And what you gain from this is the ability to do what's called code generation. You can create an entire library in your flavor of choice, Ruby, Python, JavaScript, and reference that against the API documentation, which is in a Swagger spec file. And this is coming in the spring. This means that any customer that wants to build something in their language of choice can do so in this kind of RAD or rapid application development model. It's a really big deal. We're going to be doing a lot with the DevNet team around this, and we're really excited in how this kind of helps accelerate and makes this a little bit more approachable for our IT kind of typical IT customer. So with that, any last questions? And thank you all so very much. This has been really, really awesome.
So are there any sandbox development labs or anything like that?
That's a great question.
Getting new developers to
yes.
to come over to?
Yes, so the short and sweet answer is absolutely. So we've got a lot of friends over at DevNet that have helped us set up a full always-on sandbox environment. It's a read-only environment, and then we have reservable sandboxes that can become a read-write. So if you want to check that out, developer.cisco.com/Meraki. And then we have a whole myriad of resources as well on the Meraki side and the DevNet side to help get you started.